Welcome. You're listening to Retirement with Meaning. I'm Carmen Aceta, I'm your host, and this is podcast episode number 1. Yes, your retirement questions have answers, and that's not even the best news. I imagine you found my podcast because you're either thinking about retirement, close to retirement, maybe even in early retirement, but things aren't going as well as you had hoped. Possibly you're deeper into retirement, but still there's something missing. There's still something you want. And possibly you're even that rare person who's not close to retirement, but you want to be prepared. And so you're getting active along that line now. Especially if you're close to retirement or perhaps in retirement already, you're having some questions. Ones like, what will I do? Even more importantly, maybe, who will I be? What about my friendships from work? What will happen to them? Will I be lonely? What will be my purpose now? And of course, that's only the short list. I'm going to read those questions again, and I'd ask you just to pay attention to, do you have any response? Do they evoke anything in you? Anything from thoughts, feelings, even bodily sensations that start coming up for you when you hear them. So here we go again. What will I do? Who will I be? What about my friendships from work? What will happen to them? Will I be lonely? What will be my purpose? So how did they resonate with you? What did you experience? Take a moment and I'll just be quiet. So what was there for you? Maybe nothing, maybe it was hard to tell, maybe you didn't start hearing till the last one or two. But what I did is something that's going to be very important for you if you decide that you want to work at having the retirement that you want to have. You'll need to check inside. You'll need to pay attention to how you're being impacted and pay attention to what you do with how you're impacted. I probably won't pause anymore, at least that long in the rest of the talk, but I invite you to even practice if you want to as you hear the rest of this. What impacts you? What seems like it should, but for some reason it didn't. So I'm really encouraging, like I used to encourage my therapy clients, that you get curious about yourself. You get curious about your experience, and you'll start finding you're more tuned in than maybe you were to begin with. At any rate, 2 things that are going to be very important in this work and in just about any work is, 1, to go inside yourself. It's a classic thing to do for people in the second half of life, or what closely parallels our retirement years, or a little pre-retirement in there too maybe. You'll find out, you're going to find out right now, and a lot more as you go along, that one of the big shifts that occurs, or it's helpful to let occur, between your second half of life and your first half of life is being becomes more important in the second half of life. I mean, it's always important, but the emphasis in our first half of life is often doing, and that's legitimate for that time. But being becomes much more important as a big part of the opportunity in the second half of life too, and in our own development. So 1, certainly if you work with me, you'll be asked to go inside. And the other is to experience your experience. If you don't do it, it's like you didn't have it. And many times we either blow right past it, or we have so many things on our mind that we miss it, but we go through a lot that somehow we don't have any reaction to because we weren't really there for it. So I'm going to relate a little story to you that occurred with one of the men in my men's group and in the setting of a men's group experience that we had. This was a fellow who had been in the Army and had been a paratrooper and found himself later in life in my men's group. And our men's group was out on a ropes course, or adventure-based counseling course. And he was up on what we called one of the elements. It was maybe 30 feet in the air. For someone who had been a paratrooper, you would think 30 feet was nothing. But he was having difficulty, and a part of his difficulty was because he had to work with a partner this time. He had to rely on the partner to help keep his balance, for one thing, and the partner had to rely on him. So after they had gone through this experience and they got back down on the ground and we were processing the experience with them, he said that while he was up there, he discovered that he was afraid of heights. And people looked at him and said, "What do you mean? You were a paratrooper and you were afraid of heights?" But for one thing, I did some parachute jumping in the Army myself, and it's possible to go through the training and the jumps themselves, and you're so pumped up and there's so much adrenaline and testosterone or whatever going on, you can actually go through the experience and somehow have missed it, which I think it probably had happened to him quite a bit in his life and not just in his Army experience. But that was a big revelation to him, and as he thought about it some more, then he realized that he didn't rely on people. He was going to do it alone or he wasn't going to do it, and things about relationships started to come up for him. And of course, we worked with that later on back in the men's group. But the point is if we don't have the experience in the first place, we have nothing to work with. And many times we don't have that experience because we avoid it. We make sure we don't take it in. But the end result of all that is we miss out on growth opportunities that could have been very beneficial for us and for others. So as you move into this period of your life, which for most of you listening, I would imagine would involve retirement on some level, and probably everybody in their second half of life, which you'll hear more about as we go along. It's a classic time, the opportunity for growth, to be doing something which was new for you in many respects. And to get the most we can out of it, it's going to be important to be able to be quiet, to go inside, to check in with ourselves, to see how we're doing with allowing our experiences to register and what we're doing with them, and a host of stuff that can either turn out to be very growth-oriented for us or another missed opportunity. So if you did have some reaction during the little quiet checking in exercise that we did just a moment ago, I'd like to tell you that you're a member of a large club. About 10,000 people per day are retiring in the United States and will continue at about that rate for the next 15 years or more. And most of them will feel scared, shaken, some level of discomfort, particularly if they find themselves thrust into retirement that they weren't planning, or even if they were. It's a new ball game. I mean, it's a huge change in our experience. We're moving from what we were good at, what we had a reputation for, what occupied probably the majority of our time, maybe where many of our social relationships were. And now for most of us, when we are contemplating or in retirement, it's a new ball game, and we're not even sure we know the rules, and we certainly have far more unknowns than knowns about the situation. So I congratulate you on the fact that you're either seeking information or possibly even help. And that leads me to my next big point that I'd like you to be aware of, that in trying to make changes, even changes for the good, for the better, we're going to experience some resistance. And since support is what gets us past resistance, we're going to need help. We're going to have to accept help. God forbid, we might even have to ask for help. And most of us are much more comfortable in giving help than we are in accepting help and using help. And for the many, many of us who grew up in circumstances, even circumstances within their family, that were not supportive of us and possibly even abusive and destructive, then utilizing help can get even more difficult because we have great issues with trusting and vulnerability, as well we might. And as a side note, one of the great opportunities in the second half of life is an opportunity for healing some of the stuff from our earlier life that still is an issue for us and still gets on our way somewhat as we make our way through our later years. And I hadn't really intended to tell what I'm about to, but it came to me as I was sitting here recording this podcast that tomorrow is my family's family reunion. I'm now 84 years old, and I'm the oldest living member of that family. And our reunion started in 1947 when I was about 10 years old. In all those years, we've been having that family reunion annually. And I'm reminded once again of what a tremendous blessing it was to grow up in the family that I did. My dad was the oldest of 11 children. My mother was the oldest of 6. And so I had a lot of uncles and aunts. I had many, many cousins. And back in those days, it was common to visit and interact a lot more than now in our much more busy society, it seems. And although I didn't know it at the time, I certainly learned it later, just how important that was to feel all that kinship, relationship, and people's interest and love. And here I am about 74 years later, now, as I said, the oldest living member. My sister died about a year ago. She was the oldest living member. She was 95 when she died. And if nothing else, the experience would have taught me just what a great fortune it was to grow up in the circumstances that I did, plus how destructive it can be for people whose circumstances were much less happy than mine. So whatever your questions about retirement, you're bringing a certain background, a certain package of you to resolving those questions, or your whole approach to a major change like moving from a work life into retirement. Big stuff, important stuff. And support is going to be very, very important. And I hope certainly that my blog, my podcast, my website will be some help and support to you if you elect to give this work a try. Before I take a little break to insert an infomercial, I'm going to say one more thing about support, and that is that this is no time for rugged individualism, as our culture seems to demand from us. If you're already struggling with some aspect of retirement or pending retirement, about the last thing you need is to feel weak or less than for needing help. If you need anyone's permission to ask for help, you have mine, and I hope you'll give yourself permission. You'll be doing yourself a huge favor. Here's another favor you can do yourself, because it will be adding to the information you have to use, and hopefully will be supportive also. You can reach my website, Retirement with Meaning, at retirementwithmeaning.com. On that website, you will also find a button to request at the top of almost each page, where you can request my ebook, Overview for Resolving Your Retirement-Related Issues. It's free, and you may hear some of the stuff you already heard in this podcast, and a bunch of other additional things too that kind of give an overview of the whole process that I use of approaching your retirement questions, issues, solutions. At the bottom of each page is a contact form that you can use to ask questions, make suggestions for a topic you might want to be covered, or any feedback or general comments you have to make. And I'm not quite set up for Facebook yet, but when I have that accomplished, I will let you know, and that will be another route to access information from my site. Back to the business at hand, and don't you wish all commercials were that short? You've probably noticed by now that I haven't talked about any specific individual question or needed solution. Actually, I have been addressing those things, but probably not in a way you were expecting. My plan is to use the first few blog posts and the first few podcasts to give you an overall frame for the retirement work. At this point, it's more about processes than endings. The processes are very important here, and if I can ask you to be a little patient, I think you'd be happy with the outcomes. I referred to this next piece a little earlier in the podcast, but I want to come back to it with a little more detail this time. There's no way around it when doing any kind of work that requires change, whether big or small usually. It's the classic push-pull dynamic, and the way we react to it and the decisions we make about it will determine whether we make progress or whether we settle for the status quo, which usually means going backward, not just standing still. The situation is that there's something that's drawing me, something I want. However, it requires change in me. And change is something that most of us do not take too easily. Change, like going into retirement or facing new aspects of retirement, takes us into the unfamiliar. And the unfamiliar feels like it's putting us in a vulnerable or even sometimes dangerous position. This can make us look back at what we were planning to move away from, which can now seem, rather than dull, boring, unsatisfying, whatever it was, can now seem safe and definitely not vulnerable. So the tension and push-pull can now be between the new and what looks appealing, but also seems unfamiliar and therefore maybe a little scary or not safe, and the dull, what I've been used to for years and was unsatisfying, but now looks pretty safe and not requiring anything unusual for me. So to pursue what we want, we have to be able to deal with the discomfort. Maybe for us, pretty extreme discomfort at times. Unfortunately, we seem to be more wired for comfort and safety, and many of us then let go of our dreams, which seem very appealing but scary, and settle for the safety. And often in that process, our spirit dies a little, episode by episode. And so you hear me say once again, support is what gets us past the difficulty with change. We have to learn to accept offered support and even to ask for support when it hasn't been offered. Another saying you'll hear from me a lot is that there is no growth without risk, or at least a perceived sense of risk. There's just no way to take on any significant or even less significant change and not have it feel risky. So once again, we have to be able to deal with the feelings of discomfort. That's the price we pay in order to have the change. No risk, probably no growth. We grow during times of disturbance, not during times of peace and calm. And surely retirement and what comes before and during and after it is all going to be disturbing, at least from time to time. It is, though, a major opportunity for growth. I was going to save this next segment for another podcast, but I think I'll go ahead and throw it in now. Anxiety comes with the territory anytime we're looking at change. But most of us aren't aware that the anxiety we're having can actually be our friend. Yes, you heard that right. Anxiety can be our friend. Unlike depression, anxiety has energy in it. It's lively. And, believe it or not, at the other end of anxiety lies joy. In case you missed that, at the other end of anxiety lies joy. We usually want to end our anxiety as fast as we possibly can, But if we take it away from ourselves or have it taken away from us prematurely, then we lose out on the lessons we could have learned from it or what it was trying to help us to get to. If you've ever been in a therapy group or any sort of group where there was a likelihood of feelings coming up and people experiencing some strong emotion, normally if one of the members starts to cry, at least 4 people dive for the Kleenex box to hand it to them. On the one hand, it's a caring gesture, but on the other hand, it could be that we're also administering to our own discomfort over someone being in pain or in tears. If the person dries their eyes and sucks it up and moves on, then once again we can lose out on a growth and even bonding opportunity for most of the people concerned. So in this case, we step back into safety. Over the years, I learned the value of sticking with our anxiety, of being with it, experiencing our experience, but also doing all that with support. When we can do that, then we've taken some of the risk necessary for growth and haven't stuck ourselves back in the comfortable, non-vulnerable, but more dead experience. I remember many years ago, one of my clients approaching me at the end of a session and saying, I think I'm ready to finish therapy. She said, I realize I'm always going to be anxious, but I just have to have a different attitude towards it. And she was right. I think the key is developing a different relationship with anxiety so that it becomes a relationship that will allow us to use that anxious energy to grow. I mentioned before that at the other end of the pole from anxiety is joy, and I know that's hard to believe, but I want to illustrate it with an actual experience that I had some time ago. I was with a small group of colleagues facilitating some outdoor adventure experiences. In this case, it was rappelling, down a cliff face. The idea wasn't sheer adventure, though. The idea was to use these elements, in this case the rappelling, to help the person tap into his inner experience, which was support behind him and the help of the facilitator. He could learn something. He could even grow from it. One young man, probably in his 20s, was terrified. He was on the edge of the cliff, belayed with a rope attached to his harness and someone on the other end and an apparatus holding it in case he should fall. But at the moment he had his feet on the cliff edge, was leaning back as the instructor had told him, and so his weight was being supported by the rope. His next step was to start down the cliff as he had been instructed, but he wasn't buying it in any way. I don't know if I had ever seen someone so petrified in my life. My colleague, who was facilitating at the moment, wisely just had the young man stay where he was. He didn't ask him to do anything else other than just lean back against the rope and experience his experience. And he was having a lot of experience. There were other men who had either done or were going to do the same experience of rappelling, and they were quietly supportive. It wasn't the rah-rah kind of support you would get in the military or on a sports team, but they were there for him, and they were realizing what he was going through and conveying that. This went on for what must have seemed an eternity to him. Finally, I thought he might be getting close to taking his first step down the cliff, so I walked down the cliff face to where I thought I could get a better view. By the time I got to where I was going and looked back, I saw that he had not only started over the side, but was down quite a ways. And the next thing I knew was he was pushing himself out from the cliff and then swinging back and bouncing off it and pushing himself back out again. And all the time he was yelling and cheering and laughing. He was experiencing that transition to joy. There was no comparison between the young man who was paralyzed at the top of the cliff and the one who was now swinging out quite a way and bouncing off the cliff and moving down and bouncing off the cliff again. obviously enveloped in sheer joy. And I'm certain that a large part of his joy was the accomplishment he had done in staying with his experience and staying with it until he was finally able to move through it and experience what happened as a result of not having let his fear and anxiety stop him. Obviously, that experience just doesn't occur on a cliff face. It occurs as we approach retirement, go into retirement, or anything else that is a big change for us, where we're bound to feel vulnerable. Under the right conditions, we could have the same experience sitting in a chair in our living room. As I draw close to concluding this session, I want to try to sum up for you what's at the center or the heart of the process that I use. I believe that personal growth, with the risk that comes with it, but also with the support that should attend it, is the long-term solution to our problems. Moreover, if I can fall back on retail for a moment, you get a BOGO or even multiple BOGOs, the buy one, get one. The change in me might then not only impact my concern about what I will do, but could impact who I will be, what about my friendships, about loneliness, about purpose. And I won't necessarily have worked on each of those individually, but by working on myself, I'm actually working on all four of the concerns that I had. I've learned over the years, unfortunately, that this process is not for everyone, but for those who will take it on, I've seen the results be very, very good. I remember I was taught pretty early in my training as a Gestalt therapist that I wasn't there to make things easy or better for people, but I was there to be with them in their difficulty as they took on the difficult work of resolving their problems. And I hope in some way that I will be able to have that be their presence for people across the internet, even though I will not be face-to-face with them as in a group or an individual therapy. And that's certainly something I'm going to have to work out to see what I'm able to do under these circumstances, because it's a new field for me as well. When I was operating my therapy practice and when I was doing drug and alcohol treatment, the clients were often weighed down by worry, negativity, even close to hopelessness. I tried to be the voice they didn't hear. They certainly heard the negative voices all day long, but I tried to hold up for them possibilities, what might be, what possibly could be. Not to try to get them to see through rose-colored glasses and not to blow smoke, but because it also was a reality, but it wasn't a reality they had had much contact with for a long time. And I think that one thing I can do with my blog and podcast is to maybe still be able to do that, to be able to offer people something that they haven't been thinking about because they either didn't know or they were overcome by their seemingly insurmountable problems. Well, to close, I would like to give you a little self-assessment if you care to try it. I'll expand on this some more next time, but for now, I'll just frame it as, obviously what we bring to a situation, particularly in us, is very important to how that situation is going to turn out or not turn out. My friend and former colleague, Michael Mervosh, uses the following as the motto for his Hero's Journey Foundation. The motto is awake, aware, enlivened, engaged. So I'd ask you to rate yourself on each one of those, at this point in your life. Awake, aware, enlivened, engaged. And say on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high. If you find your numbers are up where you like them to be, then things could be a little easier for you in what you're trying to work on. If they're low, then a part of helping to resolve whatever your issue is, whether it's, loneliness or what will I do and those kinds of things we've been mentioning this session, then it's going to take some work, some help to get those up so you have the energy, the awareness, the life to bring to what you're going to do. Obviously, if you bring a depleted person to a task, the task is not as likely to go well. So we want to do what we can to help you be more prepared for whatever the solution is you're trying to come up with in your particular retirement or second half of life or elder years situation. So that's it for now. Thank you for listening. I hope you'll tune in for podcast 2, Retirement Thinking Without Stinking Thinking.